What's up, everyone? It is Nordic here. You are listening to a bonus episode of the NORDCAST where I reveal my top 50 skaters in the NHL right now in 2024. It's a very special episode for you guys. Got some analytics, got the whole list, got some other stuff to talk about. It's going to be a fun one. Enjoy.
Do people in Canada have cable like other people?
We keep this up in the playoffs. I don't care.
And at Chili's. Is it a Chili's? At Kyle's?
Achilles.
Finally.
You don't know that?
Fuck you! Get this guy the fuck out of here!
Alright, well, coming in at number 5, I got Anthony Stolars.
Now! Jets are winning the cup!
Thank you for watching and listening. What is up, guys? It is Nordic here with a bonus episode here of the NORDCAST. Hope you guys are doing well. I am still here in my vacation home in North Carolina. I do go back tomorrow. This is the last podcast where you will kind of hear my audio be a little bit different when we get back to the regular studio. Things will obviously go back to the original form. So I got a special treat here for you guys today. I am going to be revealing and going through my top 50 NHL skaters right now. I did this last year. I didn't do a podcast last year, but I did do a top 50 list last year, which we'll be referring to a lot. Overall, looking at this 2023 list that I did last year now, there's a lot of things that I would definitely change. There's a few things that actually stayed the same. There's a lot of players that are no longer on this list. There's a lot of players that are now on this list. So we're going to go through a few things here. We're going to go over some stuff at the end as well that are kind of just things that, I kept in mind. But the players who are not ranked in this list that were on the list last year are Mika Zibanejad, Steven Stamkos, Victor Hedman, Johnny Gaudreau, rest in peace, Brad Marchand, Patrice Bergeron, Alex Ovechkin, Shea Theodore, Patrick Kane, Anze Kopitar, Claude Giroux, Andrei Svechnikov, Kevin Fiala, and Jonathan Huberdeau. So again, last year's list, I looked at it at the time and probably said it was a really good list. Now that I look at it now, I am not really a big fan of that list, to be honest with you. So those are the guys who are no longer on this list. At the end of this, I will go over who wasn't on it last year but made the list. There's a few guys that you're going to be like, Nordic, you didn't have them in your list last year? Yeah, I know it was not particularly great, but that's something we're going to go over in this episode. So I thought it'd be a fun bonus one to do for you guys. I want to keep producing more podcast episodes, hopefully do 2 a week, and maybe this is the start of that. So without further ado, I've already talked for about 2 minutes. Let's get into the official list. Starting off at number 50, and this is a guy at number 50 who was on my list last year. He drops 23 spots, though. So he was in the top half of the list almost, and he drops all the way down into 50. Barely scraping in this year is Tage Thompson from the Buffalo Sabres. I thought Thompson, compared to the amazing year he had last year, the amazing breakout season, seeing what he could do at a 6'7" stance, he went from that to being incredibly disappointing this past year, as Buffalo in general was, to be honest with you. So Thompson does make this list. If he has a bounce back year and looks even remotely close to what he looked like in the previous year, he will move up this list. If he has another year like he did this past year, though, it's going to kind of make that 1 year look like a fluke. And to be honest with you, when we look a year down the road, when I do this again, I might have him outside of my top 50. So Thompson does barely scrape in there right now, but he is overall at number 50. Number 49 is a guy who was not on this list last year. It is the first of 4 players who were not on this list last year, and that is Nick Suzuki of the Montreal Canadiens. Suzuki this past year hit the 30-goal plateau for the first time, hit 70 points for the first time in his career, if I'm correct. He had what I guess you could call his breakout season with the Seattle Kraken. The Montreal Canadiens, sorry. I thought he had a really good year. I honestly thought that Suzuki took that step that Montreal fans were kind of waiting for. So he gets into the list here towards the bottom. But again, he's similar to Thompson. And there's a few guys on this list at this point in like the 40s that are very similar to Thompson and Suzuki. If Suzuki has another year, which is remotely close to what he did this past year, he's probably going to move up this list a little bit more, unless if there's a few guys on this list that do better and move up past him, obviously. Again, what I usually do is I'll do a top like 60 list. And I'll have some guys outside of the top 10 that I do draft up about and think about. There's a few guys that I did realize after I released the list on Instagram, on TikTok, that I probably could have had in here. We'll get into that at the end. But again, a guy like Suzuki, definitely someone who had a really good year this past year in Montreal. At 48, kind of the same thing, but he did this with the Edmonton Oilers. He was not ranked last year. He scored 54 goals. I got Zach Hyman. Now, Hyman, I think, is an incredible player, had an incredible year, and a lot of that is the archetype of Connor McDavid, who, yes, he will be on this list, big spoiler, having what was a awesome season with the Oilers. And I think a lot of that, and we saw like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who wasn't even in my top 50 last year, even though he had that crazy year. He put up a great season in 22-23. Hyman, I thought, was kind of that same level. He was a little bit less in point production, but again, he definitely scored at a level that a lot of it was fueled by McDavid, and Oilers fans obviously won't like to hear that, but I do think there is some truth to that. In the playoffs, he looked really good, but again, he's similar to Suzuki and Thompson, where if he has another season like this, he will move up this list more. That's kind of where I stand at Zach Hyman. Number 47, this is another guy who was not ranked last year. I have Noah Dobson of the New York Islanders. I thought Dobson on that blue line actually had an incredible year. He was scoring a bunch of points and was playing pretty well defensively on what was a not so good Islanders team for a lot of that stretch. You know, obviously they were out of the playoffs for a lot of the season. They would blow a lot of leads. They end up firing their coach, bringing in Patrick Roy, and obviously things go in a different direction. But a big part of that and a big part of why they stayed competitive was Noah Dobson. Dobson was a guy that I thought honestly had a really good year with the Islanders as a defenseman. And again, similar to the guys below him, if he has another year like that, he will move up this list even more. So that's something you got to look at there for sure. Number 46, again, this is someone who was not on the list last year. I promise it's one of the last guys who was not on the list. Most of them are in the 40s. You have Nico Hischier of the New Jersey Devils, the captain of the team, obviously also faced some injuries this past year. But I think people really forget the immense value that Hischier brings to that New Jersey Devils roster. I think he is actually incredibly underrated by most parts. I'm actually surprised I didn't have him in my top 50 last year. I think he's someone who definitely should be regarded as a top 50 forward. But honestly, you know, this past year wasn't really like a down year for him, but definitely was a down year for the Devils. And I think if Hischier has another really good year, he'll move up this list as well. But again, Hischier is a guy that probably should have been in there last year that makes it in this year. Number 45, we got someone who dropped 6 spots on my list. Honestly, the dropping the 6 spots is a little bit unjustified. You could probably make an argument for sure that he should move up a little bit, actually. Maybe move up 6 spots instead of moving down 6 spots. I have Matt Barzal of the New York Islanders, another Islander here. Honestly, I thought Barzal had a good year by all accounts, but I thought there were some guys above them that had better seasons. And I honestly think, too, that where I had Barzal ranked last year, there were a lot of guys who honestly should have been on that list over him. And I kind of realize that now when I look back at this list for sure. But again, I think Barzal's very talented, but we haven't seen the production that we've seen from other stars like Barzal. Like, he put up 80 points this past year. That's the second most since his rookie season. So he's really struggled to put up offense in a way like a lot of other guys in the league have. I think under Patrick Roy, though, there's going to be a chance where he gets to flourish a lot more, and I think that kind of showed this past year in him getting more points. So he's at number 45. I think that he'll probably move up again. He'll be in this range most likely, unless he puts up like a 120-point year, which is unlikely, to be honest. Number 44, this is a rookie. a rookie, by the way, and I think you know the direction that I'm going with this. He was not ranked last year because he didn't play at all. It's Connor Bedard. Honestly, there was a lot of me, and there's a big part of me that doesn't really think Connor Bedard should be in a top 50 players list. I honestly almost made like a rule where it was like you have to play at least 3 NHL seasons, but I can't not have him in my top 50. There are some people who actually have them in their 30s, some people in their 20s too, which is a little bit shocking to me. I can probably get behind in the 40s. Higher than that, I'm not 100% sure. Again, Bedard, we know what he's going to be. We know how talented he's going to be. The only problem that I have with him is that it's like literally his first season. I can't put him in my top 20 when he literally only played one season. If this guy comes in next year, puts up an 80 point season, he's going to shoot up this list. Like, probably into the 20s, if we're being honest. Like, he's talented. We know what he can do. He looked incredible in Chicago, and they were worse than they were in the year they drafted him. So honestly, I think Bedard has a lot of potential, and we know what he can do. Again, he's like a lot of other those guys, but I'm very confident in saying that when he has another really good year, he's going to rise. He's going to be one of those guys who rises up this list substantially. Number 43, moving away from Connor Bedard, going over to Utah. The only Utah player on this list. He actually drops 19 spots. And I honestly, one thing that I looked at in my 2023 list compared to my 2024 list, there was a lot of bias. I'm being honest, there was a lot of bias in my list last year compared to this year, I would say. But at number 43, I have Clayton Keller. He drops 19 spots. He was in the early 20s when I did this list last year. But again, Keller, honestly, I think he's incredibly valuable to the Coyotes. He's put up good years. This past year was a little bit of a more down season, which is why he kind of falls down a little bit. But he is absolutely still a top 50 player. And you want to call it bias? You can call it bias. I mean, there's a lot, like, Keller is the reason why I fell in love with the Arizona Coyotes and they became my second favorite team. And now that he's moved over to Utah, I think that he's going to have a really good year, and I think he's really going to pop off. So there's a good chance that when I do this next year, Keller may move up this list a little bit. I'm not saying that he's going to move up into the 20s again. That might be far-fetched, but he will definitely move up this list a little bit for sure. So Keller at 43, I think is fair. Number 42, a guy who was not ranked last year, Robert Thomas of the St. Louis Blues. I thought Robert Thomas, honestly, had a very good year. And honestly, has been one of the most underrated players in the league for a lot of time, honestly. I think Thomas gets overlooked because St. Louis, the last few seasons, haven't made the playoffs. And by last few, I mean the last 2 seasons. So it hasn't really been that long. But again, with Thomas, I think that he has some great potential, and I think he can move up this list too, alongside guys like Kyrou and Buchnevich, guys who are centering that upcoming core for the St. Louis Blues. I think that Robert Thomas is going to get a lot of time, and he's going to look exciting on that Blues offensive core. Number 41, dropping 1 spot from last year, just 1. He probably should be up a little bit more, though. I'm not going to lie. I realized that when I released the list. I'm like, he probably should be a little bit higher. Not that much higher, but probably should be a little bit higher. I have Jesper Bratt of the New Jersey Devils at 41. I think Bratt often gets overlooked. The Devils heavily disrespected him in arbitration. I think it was this past offseason. We know what Bratt can do. We know that he can be terrific. He's not at the same level as Jack Hughes, but he's definitely someone who definitely produces at the same level as Hughes, especially this past season. So I think Bratt, honestly, an incredible young player. He probably honestly should be a little bit higher on this list. Not going to lie to you guys. But overall, I do really like I really do like Brad on that Devils roster. All right, number 40. So we're a fifth of the way done, and it took me 13 minutes. So this is already showing how long this is going to be. I have Devon Toews rising up 4 spots from last year. I think, again, Toews, I think I've already said a lot about what Toews does over the course of the last couple of episodes in the podcast. But Toews, we know what he can do. We know he can be a very good defensive defenseman. We know that he can play at that level. He's definitely on the same end as Makar, who he makes the defensive plays and kind of lays back defensively and does that stuff for Cale Makar, who is going to be on this list. Spoiler alert. But honestly, I think Tays is still kind of underrated. I know he's not as underrated as he used to be, but he's still pretty underrated by some accounts. And I think that he's a terrific defensive defenseman, and that's really all can be said with Devon Tays. Number 39, rising, 7 spots from last year, is Brady Tkachuk of the Ottawa Senators. I think Tkachuk kind of brings everything to the table. He brings that physicality, he brings that leadership, he brings that offense. I think he brings all of that to the table. And I think that, honestly, if he was even a little bit better offensively, he probably makes it into the top 30. And I know that might be a take that people won't like because a lot of people like to discredit the Ottawa Senators. There's going to be a few Senators we talk about on this list coming up. But again, Tkachuk, I think that he is terrific. I think that, honestly, he gets overlooked a lot of the times because Ottawa's not that great of a team. It hasn't been since he came to town. But again, I think he is incredibly underrated and is often underlooked, as I said. And I think that, again, he brings a lot to the table that not a lot of other players do, to be honest with you. So Brady Tkachuk at number 39, I think, is a fair ranking. Number 38, dropping 17 spots from last year. And I got to give a little bit of an apology to Dallas Stars fans. I kind of do think that Roope Hintz should be a little bit higher on this list. I honestly kind of forgot about him. I looked at my original list and I'm like, oh, shoot, I have him at 20 on 21 on my original list. So, or my list from 2023. So he drops off a little bit. Again, I don't think he's 21 if I did this again, but he probably does move up into the early 30s, if not late 20s of this list. I think Roope Hintz is a very solid point getter. He looked good in the playoffs this past year. I think he looked really impressive alongside Wyatt Johnston and Jason Robertson, who is going to be on this list as well. But again, he's another guy that I think is very exciting on that Dallas team, and hopefully they can get a cup with that roster. But Hintz is a big part of that for sure. Number 37, this guy was not ranked last year. Kind of surprised that he wasn't. We actually have 2 straight not ranked guys. There's actually more defensemen that are not ranked than there is forwards. That should kind of speak volume for kind of how casual I was back then. I don't know if I was casual, as I'm saying, but again, as not well knowledge, that's a good enough word. Jacob Slavin is 37 for the Carolina Hurricanes. I actually think that his number is 37 too, so I guess that makes a lot of sense. Slavin, I think definitely the offense. If the offense was even a little bit better, he's probably a top 20 player. I'm just saying that. To be honest, maybe top 30. Top 20 might be a little bit of a stretch. But I think, honestly, if the offense was even a little bit better, he's rising up this list dramatically. But in terms of like defensive defensemen, there's not a lot of them in here. Usually, like in this list, you're going to see a lot of guys who are good on both ends of the ice and guys who can really play well on both ends, offensively and defensively. Slavin's not really that kind of guy. He's a guy that is incredible defensively, doesn't often play offense or doesn't really score as much as a lot of other defensemen that are going to be on this list. But I do think, honestly, he is still incredibly underrated. He is still a great defenseman. And I think that he plays the game really well defensively. And I think he's a big part in why Carolina has been able to go on these deep playoff runs the last couple of years. That and their really stacked D-core. So that's all I'm going to say. But yeah, I think Slavin, big part of that for sure. He leads that stacked D-core and is honestly incredible. Number 36. 36 is another guy who was not ranked last year. He's yet again another defenseman. He is one of 2 Winnipeg Jets players on this list. One of them was on it last year, but Josh Morrissey joins him this year at 36. I think Morrissey, and I've said this in a lot of my videos, when we look in terms of value for defensemen, when you look in terms of value for guys, I think Morrissey's probably top 3. That might be something people disagree with, but if we're looking in terms of just value, he's probably he's up there. He's up there. He might not be top 3, like I said, but he's up there on that list because you look at Winnipeg's blue line. It is. I'm sorry, Jets fans. It is terrible. Like Neil Pionk is your second best defenseman. Come on, seriously. He scored on his own net last year. Honestly, Morrissey and Hellebuck. Hellebuck gets credit. Morrissey doesn't really get that much. He deserves a lot of recognition because I think he does incredible on that blue line for Winnipeg. He deals with a lot in terms of, guys he has to, face off against that are playing him on the offense. But overall, I think that Morrissey still unbelievably underrated by that Winnipeg Jets and overall the NHL, to be honest. And I hope that Jets fans will appreciate that. Yeah, I hope they do. Number 35 is a guy who was on this list last year. He rises up a little bit. It is Dylan Larkin of the Detroit Red Wings. So Larkin, big shout out to my girlfriend, who's a big Red Wings fan. She did not influence this, by the way. She did not influence this whatsoever. But again, Larkin, I think honestly, we saw the amount of value he brings to the Red Wings this past season. We saw that when he was not in the lineup, the team struggled. The team really struggled without him in the lineup. And when he came back, they were back on it. So again, if Larkin isn't healthy, this team really does struggle. When Larkin's in there, he plays good offensively. He has solid numbers defensively. He's a guy who can play on both ends of the rink very well. And I think that he doesn't get enough recognition for it. And I think that some people often overlook him. And I think he's still, again, a pretty underrated center, to be honest with you. So Larkin there at 35, I think, is a fair ranking. You could make an argument for him to move up a little bit. But again, if you were going to make that argument, there's a few guys who I think are better than Larkin that I would have to move up to. So it's again, it really depends on the preference. But I have Larkin at 35 there on this list. Number 34, yet again, another player who was not ranked last year. And this guy this past year had, and a lot of his ranking is based off of just this past season. He had an unbelievable year. Evan Bouchard, number 34 of the Edmonton Oilers on this list. Now, I've spoken a lot on social media saying that Evan Bouchard is not a top 5 defenseman. I think he's definitely a top 10 defenseman. I probably put him in the lower top 10s, but he's not a top 5 defenseman by any means. That doesn't mean that I don't think he's good. I'm just saying that right now. That doesn't mean that I don't think that Evan Bouchard isn't a terrific defender like Oilers fans say he is, because he is. He's unbelievable on that blue line for the Oilers. He literally broke the record for most points by a defenseman in a single playoff run. So being in the list of like Paul Coffey, like is it Paul Coffey, Ray Bourque, Nick Lidstrom, that's unreal. Honestly, that's unreal to be in that conversation with those guys for that record. So I think Bouchard deserves a lot of credit. I think that he's also good defensively too. I think he's better defensively than people give him credit for. And I think that, again, if he does fall back to earth a little bit next year, don't be surprised if he falls on my list again, because I don't like to put a guy so high because of just one season. I don't really like to do that. That's why there's a lot of guys in the late 40s towards the end of the list who are honestly kind of just like not like one-hit wonders, but it's really only based off of one season. But with the year Bouchard had, I had to put him that high. And honestly, I think that when we look in terms of what's to come, I think that he will have another really good year like that. And I think he will probably move up this list even more. Number 33, dropping 4 spots from last year. This is a guy who came off of a great 90-point season and kind of fell back like his team did. Tim Stützle of the Ottawa Senators. Yet again, another Senator here. I think it's the last one on this list. But again, I think Stützle, he's often overlooked a lot by a lot of people. I think people like to draw to Raymond and other guys that probably could have made this list, honestly. I think Raymond might be a guy that I add at the end of my thing here of guys that I think could have probably made the end of the list. But again, I think that overall, Stützle, going back on track, is someone who is incredibly underrated. Still, even after the 90-point year, people forget how good he is. He's going to get back to that 90-point form, might even score 100 points on the Ottawa Senators this coming year, if all things go right. But again, I think that Stützle again, he gets overlooked. And I think that on a team like Ottawa, too, which hasn't been good, I say the same thing about Brady Tkachuk. Like, those are guys who are also, like, insanely underrated and are often forgot about. But Stützle does fall a little bit on the list, honestly, because of just the regression. He probably, honestly, you can make an argument for him falling even more. Honestly, only 4 spots is a little bit crazy. But I do think that, honestly, he will get back to that form, and he will probably get back into the top 30 yet again. Number 32, this is a guy who recently went to his team, to the Tampa Bay Lightning. He was not ranked last year. Kind of surprised he wasn't, but I'm going to put Jake Guentzel at number 32 in my top 50 players list. I think Guentzel, honestly, still an underrated player. I think that he isn't as underrated as he used to be, but I think in the last couple of years, even though the teams have struggled, he's played really well in Pittsburgh. I thought he played great in his stint in Carolina. He was not the issue when they lost in that second round series to the Rangers. But again, I think Guentzel still incredibly underrated, still an incredible player. And I think that he puts up good enough offense to warrant being just outside of the top 30. And I think that he deserves being in that remark for sure. Number 31, this is a guy who rised 1 spot from last year. So he was at 32. Now he's at 31. Kyle Connor of the Winnipeg Jets. Connor, known for scoring goals. The last couple of years have been a little bit difficult for him to do that, but he still scored at a pretty consistent rate. And I think that he often is still another guy that gets overlooked in a small market like Winnipeg. Somebody who I think scores consistently 30 goals every single season, and people honestly forget about him. I think Connor, very solid. He's good offensively. Defensively, his numbers are a little bit iffy, but again, on a team like Winnipeg, where you don't have a ton to work with offensively in terms of like depth and top high-end talent guys. I guess you had Mark Scheifele there, but overall, there's a lot of guys in there that are kind of just like, I don't know, like they're guys who don't really like contribute as much as Connor does. So he does a lot of the workload, like Connor Hellebuck, who will be on my goalie list soon. Don't mean to spoil anything there, but Connor, I do think definitely warrants being in the top 40, almost makes the top 30, but he loses that 30th spot out to a guy on the Buffalo Sabres who rises 3 spots. Now, ironically, the Sabres, like when I talked about Tage Thompson, Thompson dropped 23 spots. And I think he's one of the guys who had like the largest point drop of anybody on this list. But Rasmus Dahlin of the Buffalo Sabres rises up 3 spots on this list. I think that Dahlin is an incredible young defenseman who has been on some horrible Buffalo teams, but has still looked spectacular day in and day out. And I think that a lot of people often forget that this guy is a first overall draft pick, a first overall Swedish draft pick. I think he was the first ever Swede to be drafted first overall. But again, he's somebody who plays awesome offensively. He's great defensively. He had a great 2-way year. And I think that he's often really forgot about by people around the league. And I think Dahlin definitely is a top 6 or 7 defenseman, maybe even higher by some people, to be honest. So, yeah, Rasmus Dahlin at 30. Need I say more? Moving into the top 30 now, officially. We're 20 players in, so, yeah, this might be a little bit of a longer one. Number 29, dropping 22 spots from last year. I have Mitch Marner of the Toronto Maple Leafs. I thought that Mitch Marner, he had a year that wasn't as good as his previous year, and a lot of it is just that I don't think he performs that well in the playoffs, and I think that, honestly, I had him way too high last year when I look at it now. So I think 29 is more fair, just inside the top 30. I think that, honestly, he's still a really good point getter. He's really valuable to Matthews. I think that he's still very good in that area. Just I don't think he's a top 10 player like I had him. Like, I don't know what drugs I was on in 2023. I was really high on Mitch Marner for some reason. I don't know what it was, but this year I'm really not. He drops a lot. Number 28 was not ranked last year, surprisingly, but even after winning a Stanley Cup. But now he makes this list at number 28. I have Mark Stone of the Vegas Golden Knights. I think that Mark Stone is somebody who gets hurt a lot. And he's faced some injuries a lot through his career, especially on Vegas and in that cup run that people love to bring up. I mean, just face it, you guys love to bring it up. But overall, Mark Stone at 28, I think he's a really good playmaker. He can score well, and he brings that leadership too to that Vegas roster. And you could honestly make an argument for him being higher. I'm honestly kind of surprised that I didn't have him ranked in my list last year. That's kind of shocking when I look at it now. So again, Mark Stone, very underrated. Still often forgot about because of the injuries, obviously, but still a very solid and awesome player on that Vegas Golden Knights roster. Number 27, this is a guy who was not ranked last year either. Kind of surprising that he wasn't ranked. And he's honestly a guy that I look at it now, he could have risen up in this list even more. I have JT Miller of the Vancouver Canucks at 27. I love Miller. I think Miller's great. I think that he's really fixed himself up the last couple of years since coming to Vancouver, especially in that one season where there was those attitude issues. They bring in Rick Tocchet, and Tocchet obviously kind of fixes him up a little bit. And this past year, he had a great year. I think he scored over 100 points. I'm a little shocked that I didn't have him in my top 50 last year. There's going to be a few guys when we get into this part of the list where you're going to be like, Nordic, why didn't you have him on the list? Seriously? Yeah, I know. So honestly, it's definitely Miller is someone who should have been on the list last year. He's on the list this year, and you could honestly make an argument for him being higher. Just saying. Number 26 is a guy who drops 3 spots. It's kind of surprising that he dropped 3 spots because he had a career year. He played really well. I thought he had a great season. That's William Nylander for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think Nylander played well in his contract year. If you want to say he got overpaid, I probably agree with you. But I still think that Nylander is a terrific player. I think that of the core 4, he's probably the most consistent in the playoffs. I know Matthews, you can make the argument, oh, he's more consistent, but Nylander has showed up year in, year out. He's always someone who's played well. He definitely deserved this money. I'm not saying that he didn't deserve it. He absolutely deserves it, but it's an overpay. I'm sorry. It's definitely an overpay. 11.5 for someone like Nylander is a little bit crazy, but overall, I think Nylander's still a really solid player. He does drop, though, which is a little bit surprising, but probably because this idiot right here, pointing at myself, had Philip Forsberg not in his top 50 last year, and he makes it at 25. Forsberg, I said a lot throughout this past season that he should have got hard votes. He should have, and I think he did, because he carried the Nashville Predators for a lot of that stretch. I know Saros gets a lot of credit. I know Yossi gets a lot of credit, but offensively, a lot of it was Forsberg. A vast majority of it was Philip Forsberg. So again, he's someone who I'm really shocked he wasn't on my list last year. He is honestly incredibly underrated by most counts. And there were some people on Instagram when I posted my list initially who really disagree with me for having Forsberg over Nylander. I just got to say this. Forsberg has been underrated the last couple of years. Yes, Nylander may score more points, but Forsberg is way more valuable to the Predators than Nylander is to the Maple Leafs. And some people might not like that, but kind of where I'm going to stick with that. All right, we are halfway through the list, so let's get into the top 25 outside of the bottom 25. This is a guy who dropped 6 spots last year. And at number 24 is Charlie McAvoy of the Boston Bruins. Now, he dropped a little bit because I thought there were some guys who had better years than him this past year, and I think that McAvoy's still a really solid defensive, kind of two-way defender, not really much offense there. Again, we talk about guys who are known for just playing defensively. McAvoy can score a little bit more points than a guy like Jacob Slavin or Devon Tays, but still, he's a guy who's mostly known for his defense, and I think that when you're looking in terms of defensive defensemen, I would say Slavin's a little bit better, but McAvoy is better all around, if that makes any sense. So some people might not agree with that, but Charlie McAvoy, number 24 for Boston. Number 23 is a guy who rose up 12 spots from last year. He is someone who, honestly, I've been a little bit lower on than some people. I think that since coming to Vegas, Jack Eichel has definitely been a player who has not scored as much recently as he has in previous years, obviously. But I do think that Eichel is still a really solid point getter, brings some value to Vegas. I know I've said that with a lot of players, but a lot of these guys are really valuable to their rosters. And I think Eichel is another one of those. I believe he is the highest Vegas Golden Knight on this list. I might be wrong, but you guys will fact check me, I'm sure. Eichel, again, I think he's not really put up numbers like he has in Buffalo, which is why he's not as high on the list as he's been when he was in Buffalo. But still, an incredibly very solid player, very solid playmaker who doesn't get a lot of credit for sure. So moving on to number 22 on this list, this guy actually drops 2 spots from where he was last year, so he just barely drops out from the top 20. But I have Sebastian Aho. Aho, I believe, is the highest ranked Hurricane. He was on this list last year. So again, I think Aho is somebody who's honestly still underrated at this stage. There's some people who do believe that he's overrated now, but I think he's a guy who is probably a top 10 center, but he might be somebody who lies just outside of the top 20 on most lists. Might get in there for some people, but he's just outside the top 20 for me. But I do think Aho, very underrated center. He's not a guy who puts up a ton of points, but he's still valuable offensively. He's good defensively as well. He's a great captain, or a great assistant captain. I keep forgetting he's not the captain. He's a great assistant captain, great playmaker, does a lot of that on the ice, and I think that he brings a lot of value too to the Hurricanes team, and I think that's what makes them fun. So again, Aho at number 22. Not a lot to talk about there. I think we all know what is to be said with Aho. He's been one of the guys who has been underrated the last couple of years and still is to a degree. Number 21. All right, so I gotta preface this. I don't know how this guy wasn't on my list last year. He is someone huge who I didn't forget, who I forgot. Sorry, huge. And making this list again, I have no idea how I did not have Artemi Panarin on my top 50 players list last year. He barely misses out on my top 20. You could probably make an argument for him being in the top 20, to be honest with you. He had a good year. He had a really good year. The only problem with Panarin, and this is a lot of, there's a few guys that are above him, a lot of guys that are below him, who I make this case for. Panarin really struggles with the fact that he doesn't perform that well in the playoffs. It's been facts. Like even after this past offseason, even after this past season, he didn't perform as well as he should have in the playoffs. If he had performed, I think the Rangers would have been in the Cup Finals. I'm just saying. I don't know if that's the whole part of it, but again, I do think that if he and a few other guys performed a little bit better, they're probably in the Cup Finals. I'm just saying. I do think, though, that Panarin is a top 25 player for sure. You can make an argument for top 20 as well. I am a clown. That's right. I am a clown for not having him on my list last year. But he is at my number 21 spot overall here. All right, let's move into the top 20 now. This is a very hard list now. It was hard after like 40, to be honest. But at number 20, dropping 6 spots from where he previously was, I have Elias Pettersson of the Vancouver Canucks. So Pettersson this past year, I thought had a really good year for it being a contract year. It was when he signed his contract and then didn't do a lot after that, really struggled in the playoffs, was when I was like, yeah, that's a little bit concerning. Now, I didn't obviously hurt him that much for that ranking. I think, honestly, he dropped a lot because there were a few guys that I just had to move up higher when I looked at this list now. So I think that Pettersson's still a top 20 player in the league, still a top 10 center in the league, still somebody who I look at as a very a very solid, properly rated forward. And I think he's somebody who is going to be your consistent point getter day in and day out. It's just that he struggled at the second half of the season, and I hope that he can definitely bounce back from that. So that's why he moved down a little bit. But I think if Pettersson can get back to the Pettersson that we knew, or the Pettersson of the first half, I think he absolutely moves up this list even higher. Number 19, this is another guy who dropped a little bit. And he dropped at the repercussion of a few guys just moving up past him. You're going to notice there's a lot of guys above him who kind of moved up a lot. There's a few guys who dropped still, but there's a lot of guys who moved up a few guys. And Braden Point is one of the victims to that. Number 19, I think Point Point brings a lot of value that there's not a lot of people who don't bring the value. Like Point, I've said, and I remember in the early days that I've been making videos, because I've been making videos since 2020. I've been making videos since before the COVID pandemic. And I remember in that 2020 playoffs, the amount of value that Braden Point brought to that Lightning roster whenever he was or wasn't in the lineup was insane. There was a part of me that still believed that he should have gotten the Conn Smythe over Victor Hedman. There's still a part of me that believes that. But overall, Braden Point, definitely someone who is a very solid, very consistent center, and is somebody who is still, honestly, I kind of believe is still a little underrated to this day. So Braden Point at number 19 there, I think, is a fair ranking. Sorry about that. Water break. You do this for as long as I've been doing it. This has turned into a very long episode. I had no idea it was going to take this long. But I guess you're doing a top 50 players list. It's going to take a little bit. A nice, super long bonus episode for you guys. I mean, I remember when I made the previous two in the Cup final preview and the Tanev trade, they weren't even 10 minutes. This might be an hour-long episode here for you guys. So you guys are getting like nearly 3 hours worth of just NORDCAST content this week. So hopefully you're excited for that. And again, I'll go over the schedule for stuff at the end of this episode. But number 18, Mikko Rantanen. Rantanen, I got to apologize a little bit. He is somebody who I would definitely move up this list if I did it again. Again, there's a few guys that I kind of regret not moving up the list. And this is part of the reason why I'm making this podcast. For when I do this next year and I make my top 50 players, I can go back and listen to my episode that I did, and hopefully that will help me in making my list then. But obviously things will change, of course. But regardless, I still think that will help. But Rantanen's one of the mistakes. I think Rantanen, overshadowed by McKinnon, overshadowed by Landeskog at points. I think he's still very consistent, very underrated. I would probably put him over a lot of the players above him in this top, like in the teens, honestly. And that might be a little bit of a hot take after you hear some of the guys on this list. But again, I think Rantanen still really solid, still a really solid point getter. Honestly, a lot of what I remember from Rantanen was that he carried that Colorado Avalanche team in those couple of years, especially in 22-23 when McKinnon suffered injuries and Landeskog was out for the full year. Again, that shows that it's the cost you have to make at winning a Stanley Cup. It's the biggest thing. All right, number 17 now is a guy who rose up 2 spots on my list, and that is Miro Heiskanen. I think Heiskanen honestly doesn't get enough credit. Just saying right now. I know he's 17 on my list. I know he's actually higher than some of the other people on this list that he maybe shouldn't be higher than, but I think he doesn't get enough credit. I think he's somebody who carries a lot of that Dallas Stars defense. I got to be honest with you. I look at that Dallas Stars D-core. It's not that good. It's not that good. You got Thomas Harley. You have Esa Lindell. That's about it. I think Heiskanen does a lot of the workload with that Dallas Stars D-core, and I think even though like they go to the conference finals and they lose the last 2 seasons, but I think Heiskanen's a big part of that, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for what he does on that blue line for Dallas. And same with Thomas Harley. He was a rookie this past year, I believe. I think he was. I might be wrong, but he's somebody who's come out as a really solid defensive defenseman. I think he honestly could make the tail end of this list if I did it again. But obviously, I think that Heiskanen at 17 is a fair ranking. Doesn't get enough credit whatsoever. Now, somebody who does get credit that rises up 9 spots from my last ranking is Roman Josi of the Nashville Predators. I think Josi is a guy who honestly carries that blue line, but instead of not getting the credit, he does get the credit. He's won Norris. He's the best defenseman, maybe even the best player in Nashville Predators history, and he's still doing it at his age. He's incredible, and I think he just barely misses out on my top 15 on the top 15 of this list. But I think that Josi, incredible defenseman, one of my favorites to watch on the Predators for sure. And I think that bringing in a guy like Brady Shea, Luke Shen being in there too, I think it surrounds him with an even better defensive core where he will pop off at that level. So Roman Josi at number 16. Number 15, moving into the top 15 here, a guy who drops 2 spots from last year. I have Jason Robertson. Now, Robertson, going back to another Dallas Stars player, there's a lot of Dallas Stars guys on this list, ironically enough. When you look in terms of the year that Robertson had in 2022-23, he played well. He had a really good year, and I think that honestly, people forget about that when they make their lists now. But Robertson seemed to have fallen back down to earth this past year, which isn't surprising, and I don't put that fault on him a lot, hence him dropping 2 spots. You'll notice that there's a guy above him who I had above him last year who dropped 2 spots as well. So I think these two guys are really batched together well. But Robertson, going back to the main topic, Robertson definitely fell back down to earth a little bit, and I think there was a few guys that, when I look at this list now, should be above him, which is why he dropped a little bit. But again, maybe he should have dropped more. Maybe there's a few people who thought that, he should have dropped a little bit more because honestly, he had a down year compared to what his standards are. And if he does go back to what he had last year, I think he can move up this list again. But Robertson at number 15, I think is a pretty fair ranking, or at least in that realm is a fair ranking. Number 14 is a guy that I batched him up with, dropping 2 spots from last year. It's Kirill Kaprizov of the Minnesota Wild. Kaprizov, honestly, I would make the argument for him being even higher on this list. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I love Kaprizov. I think Kaprizov is insanely talented. I think Kaprizov is somebody who is insanely valuable to that Minnesota Wild team. He is the only Wild player on this list, and that's for a reason. That's for a reason, because the reason why I believe that he is incredibly underrated is because he's carried this Wild team year in and year out since coming over from Russia in 2021. I think that he is still severely underrated by a lot of people. There was a report by Bleacher Report, or it's ironically enough a report by Bleacher Report. Isn't that something? But they said something today that one of their bold predictions is that Kaprizov is going to be a part of the NHL's next stars. He's going to be named the star. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, he's not a star already, really? He carries that Wild team. The reason why they were making the playoffs and they came so close to the playoffs was primarily Kaprizov. Just saying, it was primarily Kaprizov was the reason why they were being in the playoffs so much, and I don't even blame him for missing last year. I think he had a slow start. They missed. They had a bad first half. Kaprizov has a good second half. The team has a good second half. I think that just shows the immense value that Kaprizov brings to the Minnesota Wild, and that's why in the Robertson-Kaprizov debate, I have him over Robertson in that ranking. Drink break. Number 13, rising 4 spots from last year. I have Jack Hughes of the New Jersey Devils. Last year I had him 17. He probably should have been a little bit higher or around this same spot last year, but I think Jack Hughes at 13 is a fair ranking. I think that in some counts he's a little bit overrated. I wouldn't call him a top 10 player yet. I think he can get there. I wouldn't call him one yet, but overall I do think that Jack Hughes plays at a really high level, is insanely valuable to that New Jersey Devils team. I think he often gets not really underlooked, but I think that honestly he is a really good offensive production forward, and I don't even think he's at 100 points yet. I think that if he can stay healthy, he will get to that mark, and that's the reason why he's a little bit lower because of injuries. That's the biggest issue with Hughes, honestly. That's his biggest weakness, and injuries being your biggest weakness is kind of crazy. Now, it's not a great thing to be, but honestly, it's still kind of crazy to me. Number 12 is his brother, rising up 16 spots from last year. No, it's not Luke, it's Quinn Hughes. And there are going to be some people who are not okay with this whatsoever, because there are some people who do believe that Quinn Hughes is a top 10 player after this past year, and you can make an argument for it. You can absolutely sit here in front of me right now, screaming at me on camera or in your headphones, and make the argument that Quinn Hughes is a top 10 player. I'm not saying that he isn't. I just have him outside of my top 10 because this past year was an incredible year. He won the Norris Trophy. He was great defensively, great offensively. The list goes on and on. But can he do that again? Can he have another really incredible year like this again? And I think he can. And I think if he has another year of that, and I think that, again, it's kind of discrediting what he's done the last couple of years, But I still think that he is a really solid defenseman even because of that. But if he has another year like this again, not even winning the Norris, another really good year again where he's a finalist or just has a really good year altogether, he is absolutely in the top 10. Absolutely. But right now, for me, he's just barely outside. Some people may not like that, but, take it what you will. Number 11, rising, ironically enough, 5 spots from last year. There are going to be some people who don't like this either, and obviously as we head into the top 10, there's going to be people who are like, what the heck? Why do you have him there? I have Sidney Crosby at number 11. I'm sorry. I think Crosby, what he does at his age, being a point-per-game player, being awesome offensively, being great defensively, being Crosby, he is a top 15 player at the very least. And I tried so hard to try and make the argument for him in the top 10, and I just can't do it. I can't do it because honestly, I think that Crosby is awesome. He's been unreal, and I'm a Flyers fan. If you want to call it bias, you can. I'm a Flyers fan. I think Crosby is at this point a little underrated by some people. Some people may disagree with that and say that he's overrated. You want to say that? Sure, go ahead. I'm not gonna hold it against you. But I think Crosby at 11 is a fair ranking. If you want to put him higher, I can't really disagree with you. There's a few guys in my top 10. I could argue you putting him over, but I think 11 for me is where I stand with that. All right, moving into the top 10. This is the top 10. There are a lot of guys on this list who were there last year. There's a few guys on this list who weren't there last year. I would say I think 6 or 7 of these guys were in the top 10 last year. There are a couple guys who make it in this past year that weren't in last year. But again, I'll go over that at the end of this. So now that we're into the top 10, I'm going to start making comparables to last year's list. I'm going to say who I had at number 10 last year and who I have at number 10 this year. Because I feel like if I did it for the rest of the list, this would be way longer than it should be, and it's already way longer than it should be. We're coming up on an hour right now, so I am not trying to put myself through that, and I don't want to put my girlfriend through that either because she's waiting for me right now. So, yeah. But number 10 last year, I had Mikko Rantanen of the Avalanche. This year, I have Adam Fox of the New York Rangers, and Fox drops 6 spots from last year. I already spoke on Rantanen, and I already spoke on him. He probably should be higher on this list. But Fox at number 10. I had him at 4 last year, and this was a take that I had that Adam Fox was more valuable than Cale Makar. I since then have really not been – I don't really believe in that take anymore. I know there's some people who may think I'm an idiot from just hearing that out loud, and people who forgot that last year. But I still think that Fox is still a little bit more is at the same level as Makar, but Makar is better by a mile. I'm sorry, he is. But Fox, I think he's great offensively, great defensively. People like to discredit him, say he's not a good skater. He is. I don't know what you guys are talking about. He's a great skater. He plays good on both ends of the ice. He is a top 3 defenseman. There were some people who were saying that Quinn Hughes is better. You want to say that? You can. You absolutely can. This is a free country. I'm not saying you can't. But with Fox, I think he's better. I think, again, Quinn Hughes needs another year of doing what he did this past year to make him higher than Fox. But if you want to make that argument, go ahead. You 100% can. So Adam Fox there at number 10, I think is fair. Number 9 last year, I had Austin Matthews. Number 9 this year, dropping 4 spots from where he was. I have Matthew Tkachuk. So Matthew Tkachuk, I think at number 9. He actually drops a little bit. I had him way higher last year because of what he did with Florida. He carried them to a Stanley Cup final. This year, not so much. Tkachuk this past year, honestly, didn't look like the Tkachuk we knew. He still had a good year, and I don't want to say that he didn't have a good year, but he had a good year. It's just that the point production that we saw from him in previous years wasn't at the level that it was prior. We saw guys like Barkov. We saw guys like Reinhart. We saw guys like Tarasenko and a few other guys come into the lineup and play really well. And, I wouldn't say that they were better. They are better than Tkachuk, but there's one that's better than Tkachuk. We'll get into that in a second. But I do think that Kachuk is still a great player. He just drops a little bit because he wasn't at the immense value to this Panthers roster that he was last year, if that makes any sense. Still, very valuable, still a great player, still in the top 10, but overall this past year, he just wasn't as high as he was prior for me, and that's just how it is. Number 8, last year's number 8 was Nikita Kucherov. You'll see him later on. Number 8 this year, rising 24 spots, is Alexander Barkov. I don't know why the hell I had him so low. I looked at my list. I'm like, what the hell is he doing at like 36? What are we doing, Nordic? What drugs were you on last year? Yeah, I know. But Barkov at number 8, I think that this past year he showed what kind of captain he can be. He's not underrated anymore. I'm sorry. Just saying, he's not underrated anymore. I think that he's awesome offensively, awesome defensively, the best two-way forward in the game, to be honest. I think that there's not a lot to be said with Barkov, to be honest. I think Barkov, we know what he can do. We know how underrated we know how great he is. And I think that's really all I'll say on it. I think Barkov's a great player. And you get into this list, you get into this point in the top 10 where you get guys where you're like, do I really need to say? Do I really need to say anything? Do I really need to say, like, how good this guy is? And when we get into, like, the top 3, especially the top 5, you're going to be like, yeah, we know how good these guys are, Nordic. Number 7, last year was Mitch Marner. Yeah, insert your laugh here. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. Again, as I said, a lot. I feel like this list this coming year, or this list this past year, is way more rational than my list was last year. Just saying. But in 2023, I had Mitch Marner. In 2024, rising 4 spots from where he was last year, I have David Pastrnak. So Pastrnak, again, I think is somebody who honestly carries that Bruins team, especially this past year. He really did. I think he got a lot of heart votes. Again, this past year was a really good year for guys who, again, until my voice is kind of like dying. But again, there were a lot of guys who were really underrated, and or not underrated. Were really, you can tell I'm tired. Who were really like valuable to their team this past year, and Pastrnak was one of them. You look at the point gap between him and Brad Marchand, I believe, and I'll get into Marchand in a little bit. He probably should have made this list. We'll get into that later, though. I think that like the point gap was like 50 or 40 points. Like it was unreal, the distance from those two. And a lot of that credit goes to Jeremy Swayman too, because he played really well in the back end, which is why Boston was the higher seed over Toronto. Because even Pastrnak said that Toronto was kind of a better team on paper, at least at the time they were. But overall, Pastrnak at 7, I think is a fair ranking. He's very not underrated. He's very valuable to that Bruins roster. I think he's very good player, and I think that, again, he's deserving of being in the top 10, which he wasn't last year. Again, a lot of controversial things on that list for sure. Number 6, last year was Cale Makar. This year, rising up 2 spots, it's Nikita Kucherov. Makar will be on this list later. Kucherov, fully healthy. Again, something that he's struggled with the last couple of seasons, but fully healthy, put up 144 points. Oh, man, he had more than McDavid this past year, who will be on this list. Spoiler alert. But Kucherov, we know what he can do. He's probably the best Russian in the league right now. Matvey Michkov might have something. No, I'm kidding. I had to throw him in there. But Kucherov, I think, is somebody who he barely misses out on my top 5. But again, you get into the top 5, it's a really tough list. It's a tough argument to make. But I think Kucherov at number 6 is incredibly fair. He had a really good year this past year. If he does that again, I can't help but move him up. I can't help but move him up. He's incredible. He is simply incredible. And I think that can be said for the 5 guys above him, to be honest. So that being said, number 5, last year was Matthew Tkachuk. This year, rising up one spot from last year, is Cale Makar. Makar, I think, again, as I said earlier with Devon Tays in this episode, I think Makar, extremely great defenseman, best defender in the league still. You could honestly even say that Quinn Hughes is the best defenseman in the league. I've seen some people say that. I don't agree with that. I think Makar is the best defenseman in the league by far. The way this guy moves the puck, the way this guy can do it at such a great level. what's crazy is that he locked himself in for a Hall of Fame career in his second season in the league. Or I think it was his third season in the league. He won the Conn Smythe, the Norris, and the Stanley Cup all in one season. That's a Hall of Fame career right there. A lot of guys don't even get any of those, let alone 3 of them. So honestly, it's really impressive that Makar did that, and I think that he's still the best defenseman in the league by far. Not even close. Sorry to say, he is, without a doubt. Number 4, last year was Adam Fox, and so your laughs there. This year, rising 5 spots from last year, it is Austin Matthews. Matthews kind of had a down year last year, goals-wise, faced some injuries, and it kind of showed in his play. Only had 40 last year. This past year, though, he had 69. Nice. But overall, Austin Matthews, definitely somebody who I think is going to be this consistent scorer for a long time. Could hit 70 again, to be honest. Or not again, could hit 70, to be honest. He got to 69 this last year. I think he'd definitely get to 70. But Matthews, great scorer. We know what he can do. Kind of where I'm going to leave it, to be honest, just to get to this top 3 relatively quickly. The top 3, I'm just going to say it. It has not changed from last year. It's the same 3 guys. Number 3 last year was Leon Draisaitl. Number 3 this year is Leon Draisaitl again. So no change there. It's actually the only time in this list where there was no change. There's a few guys who only rose 1 spot. There's a few guys who dropped 1 spot. But overall, these are the only 3 guys who stay the same. But Draisaitl, I think, is terrific. We know what he can do. He's great offensively. He has a good defensive mind, too, which is some people don't realize, to be honest. He is great at all levels. The only struggle, and I think this would have put him over the top if he won that Stanley Cup and obviously performed well in the playoffs. That's the biggest thing. If he did that, I think he probably would have moved up to number 2 over the guy that I have at number 2. But again, I'll get into him in a second. You probably know who it's going to be. At number 3 again is Draisaitl. I think it's without a doubt he's one of the most valuable players in the league. Number 2 last year was Nathan MacKinnon. Number 2 this year is Nathan MacKinnon. I think that I don't really need to go much in depth here. We know what MacKinnon can do. We know how MacKinnon plays. He just won the Hart Trophy for the first time this past year in his career. If it already wasn't cemented, he's going to be a Hall of Famer for sure. I think you get into this range where I think the top 5 is probably all going to be Hall of Famers, at least at some point. So, and honestly, there's a lot of guys in this list who probably are going to be Hall of Famers. It's just how the Hall of Fame works. Eventually, everyone gets in, except for Alex McGillney. But again, I think MacKinnon, going back on track, is one of the most valuable players in the league. When MacKinnon isn't in the lineup, the Avalanche are not that good of a team. It's just facts. There's a lot of really good players on that team, but MacKinnon really glues it together and keeps that leadership, especially with Landeskog not being in the league the last couple of years. Hopefully he does get back in this year, but MacKinnon at number 2, I think, is accurate. Number 1 is last year was Connor McDavid. This year it's Connor McDavid. I don't really need to say much. I will say this. There is only one player I've ever seen in the league, and I'm very young. I'm only 17 years old. I'm not that old. I didn't see Wayne Gretzky. I didn't see Mario Lemieux. I didn't see a lot of those guys. I didn't even see Crosby for his full career. I was a young kid for most of it. But there is only one player that I know who can choose from year to year. I'm going to score 60 goals. I'm going to hit 100 assists. There's only one player in the league that can do that, and it's Connor McDavid. There's only one player in the league that can do that. I did my Art Ross thing on Instagram a few days ago, and every single player except for like 3 was McDavid. He already has like 8 Art Rosses, and he has a lot of runway to go. I think, again, next year when I do this, he's going to be 1 again. The following year, probably number 1 again. The year after that, probably number 1 again. So this is a guy who is incredible. And I already said in my West preview earlier this past week, if you haven't listened to it already, go listen to it. I'm assuming you have, or else you wouldn't be listening to this. This has to be the year they win it because you had McDavid and Draisaitl on those contracts. And I think McDavid's a big part of that. And he's actually the part of that, the team. He is. And I think that again, he's incredible. So that wraps up my top 50 players list. A few things to go over before I do wrap up this bonus episode here. First off, thanks for listening. I really do appreciate it. This is like an hour-long episode for you guys. So you got like 3 hours of NORDCAST content. This could be a whole episode in itself, honestly, but I'm not going to make it an episode because it's just me. Nobody else is on here. No Carter, no Jack, no nothing. So some stats from this list that I do like to keep track of. The biggest rise was Alexander Barkov with a plus 24 ranking. The biggest fall was Tage Thompson with a minus 23 ranking. So those are guys who, Barkov, I was on drugs last year. He wasn't that high. Thompson was justified. He had a down year, and he really dropped off on the list. I will go over the players who were not ranked but didn't make the list. But first off, the guys who were not ranked in 23 on this list that did make it in 2024 Artemi Panarin, Philip Forsberg, JT Miller, Mark Stone, Jake Gensel, Evan Bouchard, Josh Morrissey, Jacob Slavin, Robert Thomas, Connor Bedard, Nico Hischier, Noah Dobson, Zach Hyman, and Nick Suzuki. So all of those guys, I'm expecting for most of them to be on the list next year. There may be a few guys who aren't on it next year because maybe they drop off. Maybe they just kind of fall off a little bit. Again, I'm expecting for some players on this past year's list, more specifically in the later part of the list, in like the 40s, maybe the late 30s, who may not make the list next year, but I'm expecting for a lot of them to stay there. The guys who were ranked in 23 that didn't make the list, Mike Zibanejad, Steven Stamkos, Victor Hedman, Johnny Gaudreau, rest in peace, Brad Marchand, Patrice Bergeron, Alex Ovechkin, Shea Theodore, Patrick Kane, Anze Kopitar, Claude Giroux, Andrei Svechnikov, Kevin Fiala, and Jonathan Huberdeau were guys that were ranked in 2023 but did not make the list. There are a few guys that I do want to discuss before I end off this episode, of guys who actually I could have put on this list, and maybe I should have, to be honest. So first off, Adrian Kempe of the LA Kings. I thought Kempe is actually really underrated by a lot of accounts. He actually has had really good years the last couple of seasons in LA, and I think that he probably could have made this list for sure. Victor Hedman, I did make a video saying that Hedman is probably not a top 5 defenseman, maybe not a top 10 defenseman either on TikTok recently. But I probably should have still put him in my top 50. One thing that I'm kind of regretting. Another guy, Gustav Forsling, is another guy that I think maybe could have made that list if I did some further evaluations. Sam Reinhart probably should have been on this list too. I think Reinhart, honestly, he scored 60 goals. He scored 50, kind of like Zach Hyman. And Hyman was on the list, so I probably could have put him on there too. And then Brad Marchand, I think, should have been on the list too. I think, honestly, Marchand was on it last year. He should have been in like the late 40s, in that range. But again, it's top 50 list. You can't have everyone on your list. You can't have everyone on the list, obviously. So again, if you have any questions or anything to ask, do leave them in the comment section down below this YouTube video. I will kind of, respond to them as I move through. And kind of, if you have any questions on, like why is a guy ranked so low or anything like that, you can just let me know in the comments. But yeah, that'll conclude this bonus episode of the NORDCAST, probably the longest bonus episode there will ever be of the NORDCAST. I am probably going to do like my top 20 goalies the same way as well. And probably my top 20 coaches too, which I think I ranked every coach last year, but I think I'm going to do top 20 this year. Top 20 coaches too. I'll make a bonus episode for that too. So a lot of podcasts, a lot of episodes coming for the NORDCAST the next couple of weeks. Again, we are going to bring on Bartner for episode 72 in this upcoming week. There's going to be a few other things that we want to do as well. Again, if you're not listening or not following the NORDCAST on platforms, do make sure to do so. But yeah, that'll do it for this episode. Thanks for watching. If you have enjoyed, make sure to give it a listen on the podcast. And if you're watching, obviously subscribe down below. If you're listening, give us a good review. Tell your friends. We need some more reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to go follow the NORDCAST Instagram, follow at NORDCAST. I'm just going to follow the NORDCAST Twitter. Follow at NORDCAST. I'm just going to follow the NORDCAST TikTok. Follow at NORDCAST_. Again, if you still want to apply to be a worker at the NORDCAST, be a clip editor or a fill-in or coming for some episodes, be sure to submit into a link that I think will be in the description of this video. If it's not, let me know. I probably forgot. So, yeah. All right, that'll conclude this episode of the NORDCAST. I'm Nordic and just Nordic today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Adios.